Over the past couple years for Planar magnetic headphones, I'm seeing a ton of flagship Planars being built over $1,000, multiple thousands of dollars for some of these products. There's a lot of movement up there. It seems like every company on the planet is coming up with their own really high-end planar magnetic headphone. And honestly, the rankings and the overall planar market under $1,000 or under $500 even has been really boring without a lot of movement. Now, there are two new planars that I think are hoping to make a little bit of a difference and shake up the industry a little bit. You have the Moondrop Para and the FIO FT5, which I'll be doing our first impressions of literally tomorrow. Now, these are both under $500, the Para being the cheapest of the two at only $300. So this is a direct head-to-head competitor with things like the Sundara, one of the most popular planars of all time. The last Moondrop planar that I looked at was the Moondrop Venus, and there was a couple areas for improvement that they definitely had options for. One of them was the overall build and construction, and it seems like they've made a couple smart choices here. One, they've made a much more secure headband yoke system. This doesn't come detached like the Venus did. That was a really weird thing. The top headband is still kind of the same design with these perforations, but it's much slimmer than the Venus was, leaving the overall profile to be a little bit smaller, a little bit more refined overall, and with some actually beneficial characteristics. This actually feels really solid, not super well built, like you can tell that it's not super high-end metal or anything like that, but it does feel much more solid. They kind of have a similar to Heifman's style of extension system on their headband. I'm not sure if I quite love this very much. A very plain but effective headband strap. The overall comfort of this is actually pretty decent. You do kind of feel it on your ears, but there's not a lot of actual clamp pressure. It's enough to stay on your head and not move around too much, but it's not substantial like some of the Odysseys are these days. One thing that people may not notice right away is that this perforated piece that looks like the faceplate isn't actually separated from the outer chassis here. It's actually just folded and bent over and molded over into this one singular piece from the outside rim to this faceplate. It's pretty cool. Now, if you remove the magnetic pads, you'll see one of the most beautiful drivers that I've ever looked at. Same thing with the Venus. That was a beautiful driver. This is not quite as good looking as that, but it's very close. But they are using a heavy use of plastics in this driver right here, and this leads down into the connection point, which is 3.5 millimeter for your cable. And then the pads end up being able to be adjusted quite a lot because they kind of just magnetically click on. So even though these ear holes aren't the biggest, you can actually kind of forward tilt them as much as you may or may not need depending on your particular ear shape. So it's going to be a little bit more customizable than a lot of the click-on designs that can't move at all. Now, this does come with an extra set of pads, which for the price point is very nice. I haven't listened to these yet. I will for their full review, but I did notice that this metal piece that is kind of the base or the foundation for the pads to kind of wrap onto. I'm a little bit nervous about taking pads on and off often because the outer edge of this is actually quite sharp, and I don't want to cut this pad, and once you cut these, they lose a lot of their tension. So just something to be aware of. Honestly, the improvements in construction is pretty impressive, and it feels quite solid. I would say it even feels more solid in hand to me than comparative Sundara. That might just be the weight. They are using a double-sided magnet design, and a quick look at the box cover shows you a couple interesting things. One is their target frequency response versus the actual frequency response. Seems very IEM tuning-ish, but this is also a very efficient headphone, being only 8 ohms at 101 dB. So this is pretty easy to drive. And I'm not a huge fan of the grills on the front personally, but this is one of their more aesthetically pleasing designs. I think I really like the floral look. I think it looks sick. Now, I opened with a song that I'm very nostalgic of, and I think that as soon as I say it, you're going to go look it up, you're going to remember it, a bunch of memories are going to come flooding back, and then you'll thank me a lot. And that's going to be The Last Agni Kai from the original Nickelodeon The Last Airbender series. This was the Zuko versus Azula fight, the final one that had that kind of big epic orange and blue showdown. It was super sick. I just rewatched that scene the other day. The music for it was really impressive though. A lot of dynamics for a lot of the drum instruments, a lot of sweetness for the string instruments. I actually really enjoyed it on this headphone. I could tell immediately that this is on the cleaner side of sound and not so much on the lush side of sound, and this kind of continued through the rest of the listening impressions. This headphone seems in a lot of ways tailor-made towards music that is like audiophile recordings like Diana Krall, Chris Jones, your really standard examples of really well-mastered, incredibly well-recorded live tracks. This really benefited from those type of recordings, things with a lot of space between instruments, things with a lot of fidelity to them. This really needs that that to sound its best, I think. The treble coming from the Moondrop Venus is a bit of a step down, which I appreciate, but it's not quite far enough for me. It's still a little bit on the brighter side, though it does have some characteristics that I think people might or might not like. It's a little bit splashier of a treble response than it is a drilling or sharp or harsh treble response. So think less like an HD 800 and more like something a little bit less kind of piercing to your ear. The mid-range really stands out immediately for having this really good focus, but it's a little bit like the Sundara and less like something like an HD 600 where the vocalist isn't like a big full vocalist for you. It's kind of like a small, singular, really finite point of a vocalist. It sounds very clear. There's a lot of fidelity there and really good imaging, but I don't know if it quite fulfills on the vocal end as much as some other headphones like that HD 600, specifically when you get down to the lower mid-range, which is slightly strange. So the crossover area between lower mid-range and mid-bass is a little bit of a problem and quite elusive on this headphone, actually. Let me explain. On songs like Not in That Way from Sam Smith, there's a little bit of bloominess to that recording. And initially when I heard that, I expected that bloom to kind of transcend to other songs. However, when I listen to somebody like Jeff Castellucci, who has incredibly deep baritone and bass notes, they felt kind of dry. They felt kind of lackluster. They didn't have a ton of actual depth behind them. So I'm going to kind of focus on this more exclusively for the review to see if I can kind of really find the specific frequency area where this is a problem. But it was one downside that I did notice. Another downside for me, but may not be for you, is a very, very clean, detailed, but not very forward bass response. Again, this is a very clean sounding headphone, but there is a notable slope down all the way to 20 hertz from, I would say, about 100 hertz or so. It kind of just slowly goes down. And you hear sub bass notes in terms of their sound fidelity, but you don't really feel them. There's not a ton of impact. I would personally prefer a little bit of a sacrifice in fidelity here for a little bit more impact, and I think that would be a little bit more competitive with certain other headphones like Sundara, for example. But I do admit that on the right recordings, this clean bass response style is very nice. Now, I'm not sure exactly if this is what they're going for, but the sound signature here is much more akin to a Moondrop Starfield than it is a Moondrop Aria. I personally prefer the tuning of the Aria, but some people really prefer the cleaner sound, the faster sound of the Starfield. And to me, that's no problem. I don't think people are wrong for liking that. It's just a personal preference and you may have it. And I think if you have that personal preference, you will prefer something like the Para over a, let's say, smoother sounding headphone like an HD6XX. But again, everybody has their own preferences. I think so far when it comes to the build, I'm impressed with the improvements. I'd really like to see what they can do with a higher budget, maybe going back up to that Venus price tag. Okay, last thing I'll say before I go. I can see this being a very, I guess, mod supported headphone. I think this has a lot of potential to be modified. I might do some modifications before the review, but this time of year is very hectic for me. But yeah, I'd be really interested to see if there is a ton of mod support for this moving forward. Okay, I'll catch you guys in the next video. Thanks a lot for watching.